You know, I don't have any transitions in this one, so that means no music, Squirrel. So I'm gonna get it out of my system right now. Hello, nuts and nerds, and welcome back to A Squirrel Plays. Today we're going to be talking about getting to know your character. And yes, that means both your TTRPG character and the character you're creating for your next best-selling novel, or screenplay, or some steamy fanfic, I don't know. And really, this came about as a bit of an epiphany I had, if you can even call it that. It was one of those things where you see it happen, you realize it's happening, but you don't actually fully process it until sometime later. Is that a thing that happens to you, or is it just me? Anyway, this idea came about when I started working on a character for the Plaguebound campaign that recently started, and this might come as a surprise to some of you, but yes, this is the first campaign I've been in that I get to be a player. Technically, I was briefly in a campaign several years ago as a player, but it was a 5e campaign that had already been underway for a while, and it had way too many players, and considering how slow that game moves, I didn't exactly get to do anything, so I'm not going to count it. Bless that GM's heart, though, because he sure had his hands full, especially with my dumb. Anyway, I was sitting there working on my little mushroom friend, thinking of his background and where he came from and all that. Then I started focusing more on his personality and how he might handle certain situations. I started to hit some of those, I don't know how he feels about that kind of problems, and that threw me for a bit of a loop at first, and I started to think, man, am I bad at this? Which was then countered with, of course not, I am amazing. It's the character that's wrong, because that makes sense.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
But it was about that point that it dawned on me, wait a minute, why should I know the answer to this? I barely know the guy. Then the squirrel brain started doing its thing. You know, that thing where you think about 100 different things that have nothing to do with the current task at hand? Guys, I really need help. I started thinking about the times I sat with other people going through their own TTRPG character creation process, some of the characters I've seen as a GM, and just some of the free advice I've seen floating around places like YouTube. And then I started thinking about the process from a writing perspective. Granted, I don't have a character sheet in the sense of stats and numbers, but there is a character sheet involved when it comes to writing. The key difference, though, at least in my own personal experience, your mileage may vary, is that a character sheet actually comes a lot later in the process instead of the beginning. In all of the stories that I've written, never have I ever started out thinking I knew everything about a character and how they would handle any situation they might find themselves in. Well, okay, that's probably not entirely true. I'm sure some of my super early writing probably did that because it did a lot of things that weren't very great. My point is, there's nothing in the world that says you should 100% know your character when you start out. There's nothing that says you should at least 80% know them, or 50, or 30, or 20. Pardon my self-promotion, but I will use my own book as an example so you can get a glimpse at the process. And by the way, for those of you who know the mishap I had with the original line editor, I did finally get somebody to give this a copy edit pass, so at least the typos have been corrected. So if you were waiting on the cleaner copy, it is good to go. Link in the description. All right, so the main character, whose name is Bashkin, big surprise, I know. The only thing I knew about him was that he was half human, half Eshin, was a little on the shorter side, was scared of fire, and he had no home. That's it. I knew he had an accident with fire as a child, and that's why he was still scared of it, but what that accident actually was changed several times throughout this process. As for having no home, that was something he got to explore as I was writing. Could he have had a home? Did the world really hate him like he thought it did, or was he making a victim of himself? That was something he had to figure out himself, and clickbait warning, the answer may shock you. Ladies and gentlemen, like and subscribe to find out what happens! But I won't tell you, you have to read it yourself. Dang it! What I'm trying to say is I knew very little of not just any character in the story, but the main character. And as I wrote scenes, added new scenes, redid old scenes, he started to take shape more and more with each word. But here's the part you might find interesting, and I have to go on just a little bit of a detour to make this make sense. Typically, the writing process goes something like this, and your terminology may vary. You write up your initial script. You may do it once, you may do it 100 times, but whenever that draft is ready, you will then pass it on to what is called either a structural editor or a developmental editor. Same thing, different words. I tend to use structural editor because it's easier to say. This editor will look at your story as a whole, completely ignoring your typos and bad grammar, thankfully. They're looking for plot holes, things that need to be explained in more detail or less detail, making sure the reader has all the information they need for the story to make sense and flow well. They'll also do things like knock out exposition dumps, look for scenes that may need to be removed entirely, or new scenes that need to be added, and the same goes for characters. After you get past this structural phase, you will then move on to what is called a line edit. And this is where my next editor really screwed me over and did not do their job at all, but I won't get into that. The line edit is where the editor checks for consistency. This means making sure characters, or heck, even entire cities, aren't in one spot and then magically in another, but also consistency in the sense that characters behave the same way throughout the story. Their tone, their word choice, their behavior, their beliefs, all of that good stuff. It makes sure characters don't conveniently change their mind on something to make the plot move forward. It also makes sure that the rules you made, as well as your tone and word choice as the writer, are consistent. In other words, it makes sure the book is a nice, smooth ride that won't leave the reader behind. And then there is the copy edit, which is for typos, grammar, punctuation, and even a last pass on that consistency checking. But here's the thing that I wanted to mention earlier before we took this little detour. There were no character sheets involved until we got to the line edit part. That was when I needed to fully know the character inside and out so the editor could make sure they were being consistent throughout the story. And take note, when I say consistent, that doesn't mean they can't change at all, but it has to be in a way that shows either natural growth or decline. You can consistently grow, and unfortunately, you can also consistently get worse. It's the bouncing around that you really don't want to do, typically. And if you're thinking, now wait just a minute, Squirrel, didn't you just say your line editor was like really bad? I did, but she wasn't always the line editor. My structural editor was also going to do the line edit for this one, and even did the first few chapters for it, but very unfortunately, they ran into a slew of health issues as well as general life complications, and they were unable to stay on the project. It was super sad and unfortunate because she did some fantastic work, but that's just the way it goes sometimes. Now, as I was saying, it wasn't until I was way into the story, as in I had all the scenes and the plot made, that I sat down to make sure I fully knew the character. And while some of the questions were a little difficult to answer for some characters, I was still able to do so because I had gotten to know them over the course of that story's creation. I saw them grow and develop over the course of time instead of forcing them into a specific box right out of the gate. Which brings me all the way back to the beginning, which is why should you know your TTRPG character front and back? You're quite literally making a character to go on an adventure with. You're going to be there with them, experiencing what they experience. I mean, isn't that kind of the point? Let the character develop as you play. You may be let the character develop as you play. You may be surprised how they turn out. In the first campaign I ran, we had a monk who was supposed to be this easygoing guy, and I put him through the ringer so bad that they ended up giving up their religion. I even gave this player a special ability that was a gift from the deity they served, and they ended up being so distraught and torn over what happened that they outright refused to use that ability. Or at least until the very end of the game on their way to go kill the BBEG. I've mentioned the little rat man a few times before. He had no idea or any intention to betray the party, but as the story unraveled and opportunity presented itself, it was just too good to pass up. Lil was a cleric that was supposed to protect and serve, but after being forced to kill her own sister, she exchanged her defensive and support abilities for more rage-induced offensive abilities. In other words, she snapped. I was a terrible GM, man. I think I broke all the players. It was great. But that's the beauty of character development. I don't think you ever really know where they're going to go, and if you have it in your mind that XYZ is going to happen and this character thinks this way and acts that way, you're restricting yourself. Whereas if you go in with just a concept or an idea, you have room to grow and spread out. Your character can develop more naturally. In a sense, they can find their own way. Anyway, that's just some thoughts I had. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to do it. In the writing world, there's been an ongoing argument probably ever since story writing has been a thing, and that's the battle between being a planner or a pantser. And if you're unfamiliar with the term pantser, that's a term for somebody who writes their stories by the seat of their pants, which is a fun way of saying that you have no plan whatsoever. You just sit down and start writing and see where it goes, like I explained in this video. Lots of people do it, myself included, but there are also lots of people who like to meticulously plan out every single detail of their story before they even start writing it. Others like to plan most of it, and some like to plan about half of it, and some like to plan just a little bit and go from there. The only right way to do it is the one that gets you writing the story. So if you take anything from this little chat today, let it be the idea of being willing to try and fly by the seat of your pants. In other words, don't be scared to try and dive in with a character you barely know and see where they take you. And with that said, how about this video shout out? Today we will highlight Golden Griffin, which is a cool name by the way. They left a comment on my Rules, Light, and Campaigns video regarding... I'm going to make it through this video, I promise. They left a comment on my Rules, Light, and Campaigns video regarding that bit about Super Metroid where you break the glass tube. Apparently, they had no idea you could do that. And you know what that means? It's never too late for a spoiler? Wow. Maybe I just need to stop. It's never too late for a spoiler warning. Even 30 years later. But really the impressive part is going that long and never having it spoiled. I had the BBEG twist from Elden Ring and Dungeons of Hinterberg, both spoiled for me like 2 days after their release. Still salty about those. Anyway, that's all boys and girls. I'm going to scoot on out of here. Let me know in the comments below what your preferred way to getting to know your character is. Do you jump in with only a half-baked idea? Do you know them front, back, and center before they ever step foot out in their first adventure? Have you tried both and prefer one over the other? Talk to me, man. Talk to me. Squirrel out!